Howdy YouTube. So this is a T60. It's probably about the oldest generation of ThinkPad that is worth using, like the T60 and X60 series as a daily driver. I mean, of course you could use a T40 or something like that, but that's a little bit too old. The neat thing about this though is it's software rebootable. Give it a second. And you can just run normal Debian on it. I had to do a little bit of troubleshooting with this build, but that was actually due to a weird issue I haven't had before, which is probably due to the power supply, is that this system actually wouldn't load an operating system unless it has a battery in the back, but it took me a little bit to figure out, so I ended up going back through it, and that's why you can see there's like 10 extra lines in grub. But anyways though, let's get to the build. So I started off with a 15-inch and 14-inch scrap laptop from Goodwill and a screwdriver, and that is pretty much all you need for this build. So the first thing I did was remove the battery to lighten the unit, and the battery was dead. So that was pretty much coming off. In this model specifically, this unit just had a broken screen. Unfortunately, it was a 1400 by 1050 panel, but it was a little bit scrapped and had like some blemishes. I don't exactly know how Goodwill treats the arriving stuff, or if it was broken to begin with. So I began pretty much just removing most of the screws I need to remove, at least the back four for the LCD panel and the labeled screws for the keyboard and mouse pad, although some of them were missing to begin with. After that, the keyboard and mouse pad plastics kind of just pop off, which is fairly convenient, but there is more of a challenge with removing the bezel. So on these older systems, keep in mind the T60s from I think 2006, maybe 2005, but the plastic gets fairly brittle. It's not quite as bad as the X60, which is from the same generation, because the plastic's quite a bit thicker on the bezel part. So you can actually feel a bit around to find out which screws you have to remove without removing every screw in the bottom or pulling up a service manual. But if you are curious, a service manual will pretty much tell you how to do everything for that, and it's a great resource if you come to be lost during a build. So, by the way, if you're wondering about the red tape, it makes the screwdriver a little bit easier to find around a bunch of black and occasionally blue electronics. So the CD drive just kind of pops out. I could have removed this earlier in the build, but it kind of made a bit more sense now because it was impeding progress to remove the bezel. If you're wondering about other accessories, I believe they don't have a hard drive caddy for the T60, but I might be wrong about that. Also, but they do have a slice battery, which might be something you might consider, because I actually have had a lot of batteries for the T60, and I think it's the same battery as the ones on the T500, and they're starting to be hard to find in working condition. I got one from eBay that was shipped dead on arrival, but there are two screws that hold down the LVDS cable as well as the center bezel, but after that you just feel around and snap the plastic out of the slots on the case, and you're pretty much done with that step. So The next step was to begin removing the screen. So the LVDS cable does pretty much come off at that point, but to actually remove the top of the screen, even if you've already removed the screws at the back, there are 2 screws holding it on both sides. And these aren't too hard to get off typically, but you have to keep in mind the screen does have some weight to it, so I would pretty much just hold the screen while doing it. And after that, it just kind of pops right out. So, you don't have to do this in any particular order, but I decided to resolve the screen issue before I was going to swap the processor. The T60 can take any pretty much first generation Core 2 Duo. The fastest is like the T7600G or Core Duo. Keep in mind this chipset is limited to 3 GB of RAM, but you can put in more RAM than that, and the NVRAM will use it. You also, I didn't have a working CMOS battery at the time, but if you do have LibreBoot on this, you can adjust the NVRAM settings for the amount of video RAM, or maybe it wasn't NVRAM. It was anyways though, it's stored in CMOS somehow. So, but removing the processor is pretty easy. They have 2 variants of the heatsink, it seems. One for the, at least on the 14-inch model. There's one that has the ATI GPU, and that one is a little bit bulkier, but I just ended up pretty much just removing this, and you just have to unscrew that little metal sort of tab which applies pressure to it, and remove all the screws in the heatsink, and be a little bit careful about removing it because you can reuse the thermal pads on these, but it is a little bit difficult to, well, actually, if you go slow with it, it's pretty easy, but if you do end up ripping a thermal pad, you're gonna have a hard time trying to find the exact dimensions for that when ordering, and I just kind of prefer to reuse them. Also will save you a little bit of money. But in the case that you do damage one, I believe these are a little bit thicker than the later models, so you're probably fine with like 1 millimeter, or not 1 millimeter, 10 millimeters. No, wait. No, 1 millimeter. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of. Anyways, though, I couldn't find the right processor for it because I got shipped 2 T9600s, which was not exactly the thing I wanted. I mean, it is a faster processor, so I didn't really complain, but I bought a T7400 so I could put in a Core 2 Duo instead of a Core Duo. So in this case, I just ended up repasting it and reinstalling that same Core Duo chip, which unfortunately limits me to 32-bit operating systems. Also, just as an FYI, it's like 1 millimeter or 1.5 millimeters. A 10 millimeter thermal pad would be kind of ridiculous. Sorry about that. But, cleaning up thermal paste is relatively easy. I use like the glasses or lens cleaner wipes and some alcohol first, though I do use just a typical wet wipe. But the problem is those do leave a little bit of residue, but if you use something like a lens cleaning wipe, there's not really much residue left over. I decided to trade the heatsink with the 15-inch ATI one, because I noticed it actually did fit in the slot. And even though one of the thermal pads on that one was damaged, it was the one that went over the little ATI GPU, so I figured beefier heat pipe means cooler system. But when I actually do reapply thermal paste on laptop models, I've seen there's typically two ways of doing it. Some people just put the little peanut bead on, which does work, but I actually prefer getting a little bit OCD about it, I guess, and taking a credit card and wiping them down. But yeah, as you can see, the larger heatsink off the ATI version did have a relatively larger thermal, or like heat pipe. And even though it does have a second thermal pad, it doesn't look like it makes contact anywhere, at least the copper doesn't on the motherboard. So I just swapped that in instead of the slightly smaller, I guess, non-ATI graphics version. Also, the second thermal pad was damaged in that way I was mentioning earlier, but that didn't really matter so much as it wasn't going to be making contact with anything on the board, and even if it did, and they're, I believe, non-conductive. I might be wrong on that. But anyways, though, it wasn't too bad to reattach. So, also, I should note that I took this off a 15-inch T60. The only difference between those two models of T60 were they had a little extender clip to get the 14-inch motherboard to be a little bit longer. Also, keep in mind they did make wide versions of the T60, and I believe those use different sized motherboards, and I'm not quite certain about the different sized battery, but with the smaller versions, the batteries are, I guess, compatible with the T500, but it's still kind of a pain to look for them. I've gotten a few dead ones, at least for the X60, and I imagine the same with the T60, but after rescrewing everything, and if you have a monitor plugged in, you can give it a little post-test. And also I did reconnect the Wi-Fi antennas at this time, even though it isn't necessary. It is a little bit difficult to get these to go in correctly, as they're kind of a bit finicky. You can actually damage them in this process if you're not careful, but they do make a little bit of a tactile sensation when they go in properly, so just don't apply too much force and get it correct, I guess. So the nice thing is you can just actually like pop in the plastic back and have it go on. So the reassembly process for at least the front bezel is a little bit easier. Oh man, I guess I got some thermal paste on my hand too. But anyways, though, I did replace the CMOS battery just for show. I didn't look for a working one at the time, but I'm probably just going to splice the cables and solder a new CR2032 onto it, and it should be good for quite a while. Wrap it in electrical tape and it'll be good to go. So, also, it is a good idea to make sure the fan does actually turn and isn't making some sort of weird bearing noise. So I would always power it on, even if you don't do any significant modifications, like CPU swap or something like that. I did end up going with two 2GB memory sticks, so I can get the max amount of RAM this chipset will support, which is 3 gigs. You can do like 2 gigs and 1 gig as well, but I think you technically lose a tiny amount of memory that goes to the integrated card. But initially I was thinking, 1400 by 1050 T60 with, like, you know, 4 or max RAM, not quite the max processor, because I'm not going to spend a lot of money on a T70 600G. Also, another thing I do on systems I use for myself is I just wrap the keyboard or mouse pad cable, so I don't know, when I type sometimes it gets in the way and it's just easier for me to use a track point. But after that, you do have to kind of make sure everything's in the right place and check if, you know, I would check on some of the keys and the touchpad if you can actually press all the buttons without them being slightly off. But if they aren't, nothing's screwed in yet, so you can just reposition the keyboard a bit flatter or farther to the back and you should be fine. So I gave it another post-test at this point, but I still had to do some work on it. For example, rescrewing all the mouse pad, keyboard, and a few other screws. So I didn't actually have the proper amount of screws when doing this build, and I didn't buy a screw kit, so not every screw is gonna get screwed in, but that's okay, because I did not start out with units that had every screw in them, so I'm just glad something went together after this. And ThinkPads in general are pretty durable. Also, I might be changing this over to the 15-inch chassis later and using that 1600 by 1200 panel that currently resides in my T43/T42P Franken pad thingy. But anyways, yeah, that's a different project. So when screwing these back in, just kind of be a little bit careful that you're, like, not prying up something with a screw that's a little bit too long. Probably the most important screws to get if you're, like, missing a few is at least the ones on the screen, for example, or the ones that hold the keyboard and stuff on. But I did get most of them back in, so anyways, let's do a post test. And if you're wondering, I did actually just watch the video again and narrated it. But yeah, so a few other things to add here. So I did end up installing a solid-state drive in the T60 originally. It will actually have some quite significant benefits, but I tend to buy lots of, like, literal lot auction of, like, 5 60-gigabyte used SSDs, and they occasionally die. And, well, that's what happened. So during my troubleshooting period, I went through a few things, as it wasn't actually loading quite all the way. Like, it would get into the operating system, and eventually I realized the issue with it wasn't actually any sort of the hardware. It was the fact that my power supply just wasn't outputting, like, enough current. So I actually took the battery out of my T500, put it in there, and it posts and charges and does all that stuff. So that's, I guess, the thing to note if you're wondering why it's, like, hanging up in Linux somewhere. Because I originally thought it was memory, then that didn't work, so I replaced the CPU with a different one. Pretty much a whole troubleshooting process that could have been avoided by just finding a working battery. And dead battery, dead battery, dead battery, dead battery, And I have a dead 9 cell somewhere. This might be it, or this one might be for the X2 100. But anyways, yeah, and I bought a few that came dead on arrival off eBay. Also, another thing to note is the 14-inch model has a different hard drive caddy cover than the 15-inch one, but motherboards are exactly the same. There's also wide editions of the T60, and I'm not quite sure if the batteries are even compatible. But yeah, also T61 motherboards do fit in a normal T60. There's actually something known as like a T60 Frankenpad with a T61 for the faster processors and a normal, well, 4.3 1600 by 1200 T60 board, because the 1600 by 1200 panel was only available in the bigger ones, and the T60 was kind of the last one where you can get that resolution in 4.3. So yeah, T6X series, kind of interesting, useful system, I guess. A little bit slow graphics-wise nowadays, but it still works from, I guess, it meets usability standpoints. Like, I could actually use one as a daily driver if I wanted, but instead I use a X200S because a little bit smaller, a little bit better graphics. I can get working batteries for it quite easily. Like, I ordered a 9 cell recently. So anyways, though, not to get on a rambly thing there, but yeah. Oh, one thing if I didn't mention it, the T60 motherboards for the 4.3 models do not swap into the ones for the wide models, even though the screens are compatible. So that might be possible if you're willing to get out a Dremel tool, but personally I don't think it'd be worth the effort, because you can get T500s relatively cheaply too. Like, for example, I just got this one for 10 bucks, and if you're gonna get something that's wide, you might as well just go for that T500 quad-core mod I did earlier. So, because trust me, a QX9300 will beat a T7600G, and I imagine they'll have similar thermals. Oh, and just as a update, I think M4 Miller, well anyways, I put him on like an outro clip, did the translation, and I'm sorry for not putting the ROMs up there. It's just, I've kind of had a really weird month, and anyways though, yeah, I guess that's it. So have a good one. Bye.